They said it would be over by Christmas. Instead, it turned into the deadliest conflict humanity had ever seen. And the reason? A handful of weapons that turned the battlefield into something straight out of a nightmare. Look, when people think about World War I, they picture trenches and barbed wire. But what they don't tell you is how a few specific inventions completely rewrote the rules of war. We're talking about weapons so effective, so terrifying, that generals had no idea how to fight against them. Soldiers went into battle with tactics from the 1800s and got absolutely destroyed by technology from a different era entirely. This isn't just a history lesson about old guns and tanks. This is about the moment warfare changed forever, and honestly, we're still dealing with the consequences today. So let's dive into the weapons that made World War I the bloodbath it became, and more importantly, why they mattered so much. Before 1914, wars were fought in a completely different way. You had cavalry charges, soldiers standing in lines, battles that actually moved across open fields. Commanders thought World War I would be the same thing. They were so wrong, it's almost funny. Except millions of people died because of that miscalculation. The generals who led armies into World War I were mostly old guys who had learned warfare in a different time. They studied Napoleon's campaigns. They read about the Franco-Prussian War. They understood tactics that had worked for decades. But technology had moved faster than military thinking, and that gap between old tactics and new weapons created a disaster. Think about it this way. In 1914, most European armies still had massive cavalry units. The French went into battle wearing bright blue coats and red pants because they thought morale and fighting spirit mattered more than camouflage. The British had soldiers who were trained to fire 15 aimed shots per minute with their rifles, which was impressive for the time. Everyone expected a war of movement, of grand maneuvers, of decisive battles that would be over quickly. The whole concept of war in 1914 was based on offense. Military theorists believed that attacking with enough courage and determination would overcome any defense. The French had this doctrine called offensive et outrance, which basically meant attack at all costs. They thought that charging forward with enough spirit and willpower would win battles, regardless of what the enemy had. What they got instead was 4 years of grinding, brutal trench warfare where the front lines barely moved, and millions died for gains that could be measured in yards. And the weapons we're about to talk about are the reason why. The first weapon that changed everything was the machine gun. Now, machine guns existed before World War I, but they were clunky, unreliable, and most armies didn't really understand how to use them properly. That changed real fast. The Germans had the MG EU-8, based on the Maxim gun design. This thing could fire up to 450 rounds per minute. Think about that for a second. One guy with a machine gun could put out as much firepower as maybe 80 or 100 soldiers with rifles. And unlike those soldiers, the machine gun didn't get tired, didn't need to reload after every shot, and didn't hesitate. The MG EU-8 used a belt-fed system that could hold 250 rounds. When one belt ran out, the crew could attach another one in seconds. The gun was water-cooled, which meant it could fire for extended periods without overheating. There are documented cases of machine guns firing tens of thousands of rounds in a single day without breaking down. The British had the Vickers machine gun, which was so reliable that there are stories of these guns firing continuously for hours without jamming. One famous test had a Vickers fire for 7 days straight, over 1 million rounds, and it kept working. These weren't temperamental. These weren't weapons that broke down easily. They were industrial killing machines. The French had the Hotchkiss machine gun, which was air-cooled instead of water-cooled. This made it lighter and more portable, but it couldn't sustain fire as long as the water-cooled guns. Different armies had different philosophies about machine guns, but they all recognized how deadly they were. Here's what made machine guns so devastating in World War I specifically. The way wars were fought back then involved sending large groups of men across open ground toward enemy positions. This worked fine when the other side had rifles that could fire maybe 15 rounds per minute if the soldier was really good. But against machine guns, it was suicide. The math is brutal. A trained soldier with a bolt-action rifle could fire maybe 15 aimed shots per minute, and that's one shot every 4 seconds. A machine gun could fire 450 rounds per minute, which is 7 to 8 rounds per second. One machine gun replaces 30 riflemen in terms of firepower, and you can set up machine guns in fortified positions where they're protected and hard to kill. The Battle of the Somme is the perfect example. On July 1st, 1916, British forces went over the top and started walking toward German lines. The British commanders genuinely believed their artillery had destroyed the German defenses. They were so confident that they told soldiers to walk, not run, because they thought there wouldn't be much resistance. The soldiers were even carrying heavy packs weighing up to 60 pounds because the commanders expected them to occupy German trenches and needed them to have supplies. The plan was for the artillery to cut the barbed wire, destroy the German trenches, and kill the defenders. Then the infantry would walk across no man's land and occupy the German positions. It should have been easy. The British had fired over 1.7 million shells in the week leading up to the attack. How could anything survive that? But the Germans had dug deep. Some of their bunkers were 30 feet underground, with reinforced concrete ceilings several feet thick. When the bombardment started, they just went down into these bunkers and waited. The shells were exploding overhead, but they were safe, and when the bombardment stopped, they knew what that meant. Attack was coming. The Germans had machine guns set up in fortified positions. As soon as those British soldiers came into view, the machine guns opened up. In some areas, entire battalions were cut down before they even made it halfway across no man's land. By the end of that single day, the British had nearly 60,000 casualties, almost 20,000 dead. One day. There are accounts from German machine gunners who said they felt sick shooting at the British soldiers because it wasn't even a fight. It was just mowing down lines of men who kept coming. Some German soldiers reportedly stopped firing because they couldn't handle it psychologically. But enough. Kept firing that the attack was a complete disaster. One German soldier wrote in his diary that he couldn't believe what he was seeing. Waves of British soldiers walking toward him, and he just kept firing. He said the machine gun barrel was glowing red from the heat, and they had to pour water on it to keep it from melting. He said he killed more men in an hour than he thought possible, and it made him feel like a monster. Machine guns turned the entire concept of offensive warfare into a problem nobody knew how to solve. You couldn't just charge enemy positions anymore. You needed a new approach, new tactics, new technology. And that leads us to the next weapon. Artillery in World War I was on a scale that's hard to even imagine today. We're not talking about a few cannons firing here and there. We're talking about barrages that lasted for days, sometimes weeks, where thousands of guns would fire millions of shells at enemy positions. The French 75mm field gun could fire up to 15 rounds per minute with incredible accuracy for its time. It had a recoil system that absorbed the gun's kick, which meant the crew didn't have to re-aim after every shot. This made it much faster than older artillery pieces. The Germans were shocked when they first encountered the French 75 because it could fire so quickly and accurately. The German Big Bertha howitzers could launch shells weighing over 1,800 pounds that would create craters you could hide a house in. These massive guns were designed to destroy fortresses. They had been used to destroy Belgian forts at the start of the war, smashing through concrete and steel that was supposed to be impregnable. When those forts fell in days instead of months, everyone realized that old-style fortifications were obsolete. The British had heavy howitzers that could fire shells 10 miles or more. The Germans developed railway guns that could be moved along train tracks and used to bombard targets from extreme distances. These weren't just weapons, they were industrial-scale death machines. Before the Battle of the Somme, the British fired over 1.7 million shells at German positions over the course of a week. That's more than 240,000 shells per day. The sound could be heard in London, over 100 miles away. People living in England thought there was an earthquake happening because the ground was shaking from the bombardment across the English Channel. The logistics of this are insane. Every shell had to be manufactured, transported to the front, stored, and then moved to the gun position. You needed trains, trucks, horses, and thousands of men just to keep the guns supplied. Artillery consumed resources on a scale that's hard to comprehend. Countries were bankrupting themselves buying raw materials and manufacturing ammunition. Artillery killed more soldiers in World War I than any other weapon. Some estimates put it at around 70% of all casualties. Think about sitting in a trench while shells rain down on you for hours, days, with no way to fight back, no way to escape, just hoping the next one doesn't land directly on top of you. The psychological impact of artillery was insane. Soldiers described the sound as being like the end of the world. The constant screaming of shells overhead, the explosions that would throw dirt and debris everywhere, the concussive force that would knock you unconscious even if you weren't directly hit. Some men would just break down mentally after days of bombardment, unable to function, shaking uncontrollably. There are accounts of soldiers who went deaf from the constant noise. Not temporarily deaf, permanently deaf. The sound pressure from artillery explosions is enough to rupture eardrums and destroy the tiny bones in your inner ear. Soldiers would be shouting at each other from a foot away and couldn't hear anything. The concussive force of explosions would cause internal injuries without any visible wounds. Soldiers would seem fine after a bombardment, then collapse and die hours later from internal bleeding or organ damage. The pressure wave from a large explosion can literally scramble your insides even if you're not hit by shrapnel. The sound alone was enough to drive men insane. Shell shock wasn't just some made-up condition. It was a real psychological breakdown caused by the constant bombardment. Soldiers would lose their hearing, develop uncontrollable shakes, go completely catatonic. And if you showed these symptoms, some armies would accuse you of cowardice and execute you. The British shot over 300 of their own soldiers for cowardice or desertion during the war, many of whom were probably suffering from what we'd now recognize as severe PTSD. Shell shock manifested in different ways. Some men would develop a stutter and be unable to speak normally. Some would develop uncontrollable tremors, shaking constantly like they were freezing. Some would just stare, blankly at nothing, completely unresponsive to the world around them. Some would have nightmares so bad they'd scream themselves awake every night for years after the war ended. The treatment for shell shock was controversial. Some doctors thought it was a legitimate medical condition and tried to help these men recover. Others thought they were cowards and malingerers who deserved punishment. Some shell shock victims were sent to hospitals, others were court-martialed and shot. It depended on your commanding officer and which doctor examined you. But here's the thing about artillery in World War I. It was supposed to solve the machine gun problem. The idea was simple. Shell the enemy trenches until everything's destroyed, then send in your infantry to mop up whatever's left. In theory, it made sense. In practice, it almost never worked. The Germans would dig deeper. They'd create concrete bunkers that could withstand almost anything except a direct hit. Some of these bunkers were 30 or 40 feet underground, with multiple levels and reinforced ceilings. Soldiers would go down into these dugouts during a bombardment and just wait it out. They'd have food, water, even electric lights in some of the more elaborate ones. The deeper German dugouts were amazing pieces of engineering. They'd have multiple entrances, so if one was blocked by debris, you could use another. They'd have ventilation systems to provide fresh air. They'd have bunks for sleeping, storage areas for ammunition and supplies, even rudimentary medical facilities. Some of the larger ones could hold hundreds of men. So, when the bombardment stopped and the attacking infantry started moving forward, the German soldiers would climb out of their deep dugouts, set up their machine guns, and mow down the attackers just like before. The attackers would be surprised because they thought everyone was dead. But nope, there they were, machine guns ready to go. The Germans also learned to use reverse slope defense. They'd position their main defenses on the far side of a ridge or hill, where incoming artillery couldn't see them and had trouble hitting them. The forward trenches would be lightly held, just enough to slow down an attack. The real defenses were further back, waiting. Plus, all that artillery fire would tear up the ground so badly that it became almost impossible to cross. You'd have these lunar landscapes of craters filled with water, mud, and pieces of bodies. Men would fall into these craters and drown in the mud. Horses would get stuck and die. Artillery was devastating, but it didn't solve the fundamental problem of trench warfare. There's this famous calculation that historians have done. At the Battle of Verdun, which lasted almost the entire year of 1916, approximately 60 million artillery shells were fired by both sides. The battle covered an area of maybe 10 square miles. That means every square yard of ground was hit by an average of 6 shells. The landscape was completely destroyed, turned into something that looked like the surface of the moon. Verdun became a symbol of the war's futility. The Germans wanted to bleed France white by attacking a position the French had to defend. The French were determined not to let Verdun fall because it was symbolically important. So both sides poured men and shells into this battle that didn't really matter strategically. By the end, roughly 700,000 men were dead or wounded, and the front lines had barely moved. The amount of industrial production required to sustain this kind of artillery warfare was staggering. Entire economies were reorganized to produce shells. Factories that used to make cars or tools were converted to make ammunition. Women were brought into the workforce in huge numbers to replace men who were at the front. Countries went into massive debt buying raw materials. The war became as much about industrial capacity as it was about military skill. Britain had to import huge amounts of steel, copper, and explosives. They set up munitions factories all over the country. The Ministry of Munitions, headed by David Lloyd George, oversaw the production of weapons and ammunition. At its peak, the ministry employed millions of workers and controlled thousands of factories. This was total war, where entire societies were mobilized for military production. Artillery also evolved during the war. At the start, most artillery fire was direct fire, meaning you could see your target. By the end of the war, indirect fire was the norm. Forward observers would spot targets, calculate coordinates, and radio back to artillery positions miles behind the lines. The gunners would fire at targets they couldn't even see, using math and maps to figure out the trajectory. The development of aerial observation revolutionized artillery. Planes could fly over enemy lines and radio back information about where shells were landing. This allowed for much more accurate fire. Before aircraft, artillery was basically firing blind and hoping to hit something. With aircraft spotting, artillery could be adjusted in real time and became much more effective. They also developed different types of shells for different purposes. High explosive shells for destroying fortifications, shrapnel shells that would explode in the air and rain metal fragments down on troops in the open, gas shells that would release chemical weapons, smoke shells to provide cover. The variety and sophistication of artillery ammunition increased dramatically over the course of the war. Shrapnel shells were particularly nasty. They'd be set to explode at a certain height above the ground, and when they exploded, hundreds of metal balls would spray downward. If you were caught in the open when a shrapnel shell went off overhead, you'd be hit by multiple projectiles. It was designed to kill people, not destroy structures. High explosive shells were for destroying bunkers, trenches, and fortifications. They'd have thick metal casings packed with explosives. When they hit, they'd create a massive explosion and throw shrapnel in all directions. A direct hit from a heavy high explosive shell could completely destroy a bunker or create a crater 20 feet across. So armies needed something that could cross no man's land, ignore machine gun fire, and break through enemy trenches. They needed the tank. The first tanks were British. The Mark I tank rolled onto the battlefield in September 1916 during the Battle of the Somme. It was slow, unreliable, broke down constantly, and the crew inside was basically being cooked alive by the heat of the engine. But it could do something no other weapon could do. It could cross trenches, crush barbed wire, and keep moving while machine gun bullets bounced off its armor. The tanks were called tanks because the British wanted to keep them secret during development. They told people they were building water tanks for the troops in the Middle East, and the name stuck. The whole project was so secret that even most British soldiers didn't know what they were until they saw them rolling toward the front lines. The Mark I looked like nothing anyone had ever seen before. It was basically a big metal box on tracks, with guns sticking out the sides. It was 26 feet long, over 13 feet wide, and weighed 28 tons. It moved at a top speed of about 4 miles per hour on flat ground, slower on rough terrain. It could cross trenches up to 9 feet wide and climb obstacles up to 4 feet high. Operating a Mark I tank was absolutely miserable. The interior temperature could reach 120 degrees Fahrenheit or more. The engine was loud enough to permanently damage your hearing. There was no suspension, so every bump would throw the crew around inside. Visibility was terrible, so the commander would have to stick his head out of a hatch to see where they were going, which obviously made him a target for snipers. The crew consisted of 8 men, a commander, a driver, 2 gearsmen who operated the gears because the driver couldn't do it alone, and 4 gunners. The gearsmen had to use hammers to change gears because the transmission was so stiff. Communication inside the tank was almost impossible because of the noise, so they'd communicate by hitting each other on the shoulder or using hand signals. The air inside a tank was toxic. The engine produced carbon monoxide fumes that would leak into the crew compartment. The guns produced smoke when they fired. If a machine gun bullet hit the armor, it wouldn't penetrate, but it would create a spray of molten metal on the inside that could blind or burn the crew. Crews would wear leather helmets and chainmail masks to protect themselves from these metal splashes. Tanks were also incredibly hot. The engine would heat up the entire interior, and there was no ventilation system. Crews would be drenched in sweat after just a few minutes. Many tank crews would pass out from heat exhaustion during operations. Some tanks had to stop multiple times during a battle just so the crew could get out and cool down. The early tanks weren't game changers right away. They were too unreliable. Out of 49 tanks that were supposed to attack during their first use, only 32 even made it to the starting line. Of those, only about 9 actually made any real progress. The rest broke down, got stuck, or had mechanical failures. The main problems were mechanical reliability and the terrain. Tanks would throw their tracks, which meant the crew would have to get out under fire and try to fix them. Engines would overheat and break down. The rough terrain of no man's land, with all the shell craters and mud, was almost impossible for early tanks to navigate. Many tanks would get stuck in craters or mud and become sitting targets for German artillery. But the concept was proven. Tanks could cross no man's land. They could scare the absolute hells out of enemy soldiers who had never seen anything like them before. And most importantly, they could survive long enough to actually reach enemy trenches. The psychological impact of tanks was significant, especially early on. German soldiers who had never seen a tank before would sometimes panic and run when they saw these metal monsters crawling toward them. There are reports of entire units abandoning their positions because they didn't know how to fight against tanks. One German soldier described seeing his first tank and thinking it was some kind of prehistoric monster come to life. By 1917 and 1918, tanks were getting better. The British developed lighter, faster models. The Mark IV was more reliable than the Mark I. It had thicker armor and better weapons, and could actually be driven by one person instead of needing the gearsmen. The Mark V had even better transmission and could be driven by the commander alone, which freed up crew members for other tasks. The British also developed specialized tanks. Some had fascines, which were huge bundles of wood that could be dropped into wide trenches to create a bridge. Some had grappling hooks for tearing down barbed wire. Some carried supplies or could be used as mobile command posts. The British were innovating quickly, learning what worked and what didn't. The French built the Renault FT, which had a rotating turret and became the basic template for almost every tank designed after it. Before the Renault FT, tanks had fixed guns that could only fire in certain directions. The rotating turret meant the tank could fire in any direction without having to turn the entire vehicle. This seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary at the time. The Renault FT was also much smaller and lighter than British tanks. It weighed only about 7 tons and could be produced much more quickly and cheaply. The French built over 3,000 of them during the war. The design was so good that some Renault FTs were still in use during World War II, more than 20 years after they were first built. The Germans tried to build their own tanks but didn't really commit to the idea. They only produced about 20 A7V tanks during the entire war. The A7V was huge, weighing 30 tons and requiring a crew of 18 men. It was slow, unreliable, and couldn't cross trenches very well. The Germans basically looked at tanks and decided they weren't worth the effort, which was a massive strategic mistake. Instead of building their own tanks, the Germans focused on anti-tank weapons. They developed armor-piercing bullets for machine guns. They used artillery in direct fire mode to shoot at tanks. They trained infantry to attack tanks with grenades and explosive charges. These tactics worked to some extent, but they didn't change the fact that tanks gave the Allies a significant advantage. The Battle of Cambrai in November 1917 showed what tanks could really do when used properly. The British sent nearly 500 tanks forward in a surprise attack without the usual lengthy artillery bombardment that would warn the Germans something was coming. They broke through German lines and advanced further in a few hours than previous offensives had managed in months. At Cambrai, the tanks were used in coordination with infantry and aircraft. The tanks would crush barbed wire and cross trenches, creating paths for the infantry. Infantry would follow close behind the tanks, protected from machine gun fire. Aircraft would fly low and attack German positions with machine guns and small bombs. It was combined arms warfare, and it worked. The British advanced about 5 miles on the first day, which doesn't sound like much, but in World War I terms that was huge. The initial success at Cambrai was amazing. German soldiers were surrendering in large numbers. The British captured hundreds of guns and thousands of prisoners. Church bells rang in London to celebrate the victory. People thought the war might actually be won soon. But then things fell apart. The British didn't have enough reserves to exploit the breakthrough. The tanks broke down or ran out of fuel. The Germans counterattacked and took back most of the lost ground. By the end of the battle, the British had lost almost as many men as they'd captured. It was another example of initial success followed by stalemate. Of course, the Germans eventually figured out how to deal with tanks. They'd use artillery in direct fire mode, shooting at tanks like they were shooting at bunkers. They developed armor-piercing bullets and special armor-piercing rounds for their artillery. They'd dig wider trenches that tanks couldn't cross, sometimes 12 or 15 feet wide. They'd use artillery to create massive craters that tanks would fall into and get stuck. The British and French would lose hundreds of tanks. But the idea was out there and it wasn't going away. German soldiers were also trained to attack tanks directly. They'd wait until a tank got close, then throw grenades at it, or place explosive charges on it. This required a lot of courage because you had to get within a few feet of the tank, but it worked. Some brave German soldiers became tank killers, personally destroying multiple tanks. Tank crews had one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. If a tank was hit by artillery, it could catch fire, and the crew would be trapped inside. Getting out of a burning tank was incredibly difficult, because the hatches were small and the crew was disoriented. Some crews would carry pistols not to fight the enemy, but to shoot themselves if their tank caught fire and they couldn't escape. There are stories of tank crews burning to death inside their vehicles while enemy soldiers watched, unable or unwilling to help. Being trapped in a burning tank was probably one of the worst ways to die in the war, and there were a lot of bad ways to die. There's this concept in military history called combined arms warfare, and World War I is really where it developed. The idea is that different types of weapons and units work together to be more effective than they would be alone. Tanks couldn't win battles by themselves, but tanks working with infantry, supported by artillery, With aircraft providing reconnaissance and close air support, that combination was incredibly powerful. Now, let's talk about chemical weapons because World War I is when gas warfare became a real thing, and it was absolutely horrific. The Germans first used chlorine gas in April 1915 at the Second Battle of Ypres. They released 168 tons of the stuff from cylinders, and the wind carried it toward French and Algerian positions. Soldiers saw this weird yellow-green cloud drifting toward them and had no idea what it was. Then they started choking. The gas release at Ypres was massive. The Germans had installed thousands of cylinders along a 4-mile section of the front. When they opened the valves, the gas formed a cloud that drifted across no man's land toward the Allied trenches. It moved slowly, pushed by the wind, silent and deadly. Chlorine gas attacks your respiratory system. It reacts with the moisture in your lungs and creates hydrochloric acid. You're basically drowning and being burned from the inside at the same time. Men would cough up pieces of their lungs. Their skin would turn blue. They'd die slowly, painfully, struggling for air that wouldn't come. Soldiers caught by the gas would panic. They'd try to run away, but running just made them breathe harder and inhale more gas. Some would collapse immediately, choking and vomiting. Others would make it back to aid stations where there was nothing doctors could do for them. They'd just have to watch as these men slowly suffocated over hours or even days. The thing about that first gas attack is that it actually worked really well from a military perspective. It created a gap in the Allied lines several miles wide. The French and Algerian troops just fled in panic. They had no protection, no idea what was happening, and were dying horribly. But the Germans weren't prepared for their own success and didn't have enough reserves to exploit the breakthrough. So the opportunity was wasted. The Germans also didn't fully commit to the attack because they weren't sure the gas would work. They treated it as an experiment rather than a major offensive. If they had prepared properly and had reserves ready, they might have broken through the Allied lines completely. But they hesitated, and the Allies were able to regroup and seal the gap. After that, both sides went all in on chemical warfare. You had chlorine, phosgene, mustard gas, and various combinations. Each type of gas had different effects and required different countermeasures. Phosgene was even deadlier than chlorine but didn't have as obvious symptoms right away, so soldiers might not realize they'd been exposed until it was too late. Phosgene was particularly dangerous because it smelled like fresh hay or cut grass, which wasn't immediately alarming. Soldiers might smell it and not realize they were being gassed until they started having trouble breathing hours later. By then, the damage was done. Phosgene would cause fluid to build up in the lungs, essentially causing you to drown in your own bodily fluids. Mustard gas was particularly nasty because it didn't just affect your lungs. It would blister your skin, blind you, and could stay active in the soil for weeks or even months. Soldiers would walk through areas that had been gassed weeks earlier and still get exposed. Mustard gas smelled sweet, like mustard or garlic, which is where the name came from. But that sweet smell meant you were in serious trouble. Mustard gas was a blistering agent. It would cause huge, painful blisters wherever it touched your skin. If it got in your eyes, it would blind you, sometimes permanently. If you breathed it in, it would blister your lungs and throat. The blisters would become infected, and even if you survived the initial exposure, you might die later from infection or complications. The worst thing about mustard gas was that it was persistent. Unlike chlorine or phosgene, which would disperse fairly quickly, mustard gas would contaminate the ground and equipment for a long time. You could pick up a rifle that had been exposed to mustard gas a week earlier and still get blisters on your hands. This made it an area denial weapon, preventing troops from using certain areas of the battlefield. Gas attacks created this constant fear. You'd hear the alarm, usually someone banging on a metal shell casing or ringing a bell, and you'd have maybe seconds to get your gas mask on. If the seal wasn't tight, you were done. If the mask was damaged, you were done. If you were sleeping and didn't hear the alarm, you were done. Soldiers had to sleep with their gas masks nearby at all times. Some would sleep with them on because they were so paranoid about gas attacks. The masks were uncomfortable and made it hard to breathe, but that was better than being gassed. Soldiers would practice putting on their masks quickly, trying to get the time down to just a few seconds. The early gas masks were terrible. Just cloth soaked in chemicals that supposedly neutralized the gas. They barely worked and made it hard to breathe even when there wasn't gas around. Later, masks got better, with rubber seals and actual filters, but they were still uncomfortable and limited your vision and ability to communicate. Early protection against gas was almost laughable. Soldiers were told to urinate on cloth and hold it over their faces. The ammonia in urine supposedly helped neutralize chlorine gas. Whether this actually worked or not is debatable, but desperate soldiers tried it. Later, they were issued cloth masks soaked in chemical solutions, but these were only marginally effective. The improved gas masks had charcoal filters that would absorb the gas. They had rubber seals that went around your face to prevent gas from seeping in. They had glass or plastic eyepieces so you could see. But they were still uncomfortable and restrictive. Your vision was limited. Your hearing was muffled. You couldn't eat or drink while wearing them. Communication was almost impossible. Both sides developed gas masks pretty quickly, which reduced the effectiveness of gas attacks. But gas still caused hundreds of thousands of casualties. Even if it didn't kill you, it could permanently damage your lungs, leave you blind, or mess you up psychologically for the rest of your life. There are accounts of gas victims dying years after the war ended because their lungs were so damaged. Some went blind permanently. Others had chronic breathing problems. Gas was one of those weapons that kept killing long after the war was over. Veterans with damaged lungs were more susceptible to diseases like tuberculosis and pneumonia. Many died young from respiratory problems that could be traced back to gas exposure during the war. The weird thing about chemical weapons in World War I is that they didn't really change the outcome of the war. They were terrible and caused immense suffering, but they didn't break the stalemate. They were just another horrible thing soldiers had to deal with. Both sides used gas, so neither side gained a permanent advantage. It just made everything worse for everyone. Gas attacks accounted for about 3% of combat deaths, but about 30% of casualties. That's because gas often disabled rather than killed. A soldier who was gassed might survive, but be unable to fight for weeks or months. From a military perspective, this was actually useful because it removed soldiers from the battlefield without killing them, and taking care of wounded soldiers tied up. Resources. After World War I, chemical weapons were so hated that countries agreed to ban them. The Geneva Protocol of 1925 prohibited the use of chemical and biological weapons in warfare. It's one of the few cases where a weapon was so horrible that the world collectively decided not to use it anymore. Of course, countries still stockpiled chemical weapons, and they've been used in some conflicts since then, but the taboo against them is strong. Let's talk about another weapon that changed warfare, the flamethrower. The Germans loved this thing. They called it the Flammenwerfer, and it was exactly what it sounds like. A device that shoots burning liquid at enemy positions. The way flamethrowers worked was pretty simple. You'd have a backpack tank filled with flammable liquid, usually a mixture of oil and gasoline. Pressurized gas, usually nitrogen, would force the liquid through a hose and out a nozzle. At the nozzle, the liquid would be ignited, creating a jet of fire. The German Flammenwerfer 35 could shoot flame up to about 80 feet. The fuel tank held enough for about 10 seconds of continuous fire, or about 20-25 short bursts. The entire unit weighed about 80 pounds when full, so flamethrower operators had to be strong. They'd also carry extra fuel tanks so they could refill in the field. Flamethrowers were terrifying. The range wasn't great, maybe 60 feet or so for the early models, but if you were in a trench or a bunker and someone pointed one of these things at you, you had two choices: burn alive or run out into machine gun fire. Neither option was great. The psychological effect of flamethrowers was out of proportion to their actual military effectiveness. Seeing a jet of fire shooting toward you triggered primal fear. Fire is one of humanity's oldest fears, and having it weaponized in this way was deeply disturbing. Many soldiers would surrender immediately when they saw flamethrowers rather than face being burned alive. The Germans used flamethrowers to clear trenches and bunkers. They'd send in assault troops with flamethrowers first, and these guys would basically cook anyone who didn't surrender or run. It was psychological warfare as much as anything else. The sight of a soldier with a flamethrower walking toward your position would make a lot of people just give up. German tactics involved using flamethrowers in combination with other weapons. They'd suppress a position with machine gun and rifle fire, then send in flamethrower teams to finish the job. The defenders would be pinned down by gunfire, unable to escape, and then the flamethrowers would hit them. It was brutally effective for clearing bunkers and fortified positions. Other armies adopted flamethrowers too, but the Germans used them most effectively. The British and French developed their own versions, but they never relied on them as heavily as the Germans did. The Germans had specialized flamethrower units, trained specifically in assault tactics and trench-clearing operations. The problem with flamethrowers from the user's perspective was that you were carrying a big tank of highly flammable fuel on your back. If someone hit that tank with a bullet or a piece of shrapnel, you'd explode. Flamethrower operators had a very short life expectancy. Some estimates put the average survival time of a flamethrower operator at just a few minutes once they entered combat. There was also the issue that if you were captured with a flamethrower, the enemy soldiers would often just kill you immediately instead of taking you prisoner. Flamethrowers were seen as particularly cruel weapons, and soldiers hated them so much that they'd take revenge on anyone using one. Flamethrower operators knew this, which made an already dangerous job even more stressful. Allied soldiers specifically targeted flamethrower operators. They became priority targets for snipers and machine gunners. Everyone wanted to kill the flamethrower guy before he got close enough to use his weapon. German flamethrower units suffered massive casualties, but there were always volunteers to replace them, usually young soldiers who wanted to prove their courage. Despite the risks, flamethrowers were effective at clearing fortified positions. A bunker that could withstand artillery shells might have a small opening for firing or ventilation, and a flamethrower could shoot fire right through that opening. The people inside would either burn or suffocate from the smoke and lack of oxygen. It was brutal, but it worked. The other use for flamethrowers was clearing barbed wire obstacles. The fire would burn away the wooden posts and stakes, and the heat would weaken the wire. This was faster than trying to cut through wire by hand, and it could be done under fire. German assault troops would use flamethrowers to clear paths through wire obstacles. Then infantry would follow through the gaps. Now we need to talk about aircraft, because World War I was when planes went from being basically useless curiosities to actual weapons of war. At the start of the war, planes were used for reconnaissance. Pilots would fly over enemy lines, look at what they could see, maybe take some photographs and report back. No weapons, no fighting, just looking around. Pilots from opposing sides would sometimes wave at each other when they passed in the air because nobody thought of planes as weapons yet. The early aircraft were incredibly primitive. They were made of wood and fabric, held together with wire and glue. They had tiny engines that were unreliable and weak. Top speeds were maybe 70 or 80 miles per hour. They couldn't fly very high, usually just a few thousand feet. They were vulnerable to weather, mechanical problems, and even small arms fire from the ground. But even these primitive planes proved their value immediately. Reconnaissance aircraft could see things that ground observers couldn't. They could spot troop movements, artillery positions, supply dumps. During the First Battle of the Marne in 1914, French reconnaissance aircraft spotted a gap in the German advance, and the French were able to exploit this gap and stop the German offensive. Planes had already affected the outcome of a major battle. Then pilots started taking pistols and rifles up with them. If they saw an enemy plane, they'd take shots at it. Sometimes they'd even throw bricks or grenades. It was ridiculous, but it showed that people were thinking about how to use planes offensively. There are stories of pilots throwing darts at enemy planes or trying to snag their wings with grappling hooks. It was improvised and desperate, but it was the beginning of air combat. The game changer was figuring out how to mount machine guns on planes. The problem was the propeller. If you mounted a machine gun that fired forward, you'd shoot off your own propeller. Some planes mounted guns on top of the wing or had a second crew member with a gun, but that wasn't ideal. The solution was the interrupter gear, which synchronized the machine gun with the propeller, so bullets would only fire when the propeller blades were out of the way. The interrupter gear was a mechanical device that connected the machine gun to the engine. Every time a propeller blade passed in front of the gun barrel, the mechanism would prevent the gun from firing. It sounds simple, but it was an engineering challenge to make it work reliably at high speeds. When it worked, it gave the pilot the ability to aim the entire plane at a target and fire straight ahead, which was far more effective than trying to aim a gun separately. The Germans figured this out first with the Fokker Eindecker, and for a while they dominated the skies. Allied pilots called this period the Fokker Scourge because German pilots were shooting down Allied planes left and right. The Allies eventually developed their own synchronized guns and better planes, and the air war became more balanced. The Fokker Eindecker wasn't even a particularly good plane. It was slow and not very maneuverable, but having a forward-firing machine gun gave it a huge advantage. German pilots like Max Immelmann and Oswald Boelke became aces, developing tactics for aerial combat. They'd dive out of the sun to attack, use altitude advantage, work in pairs to trap enemy planes. And these tactics are still taught to fighter pilots today. Once fighters had forward-firing machine guns, aerial combat became a real thing. You had dogfights, aces, the whole deal. Guys like the Red Baron became famous for shooting down enemy planes. Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, had 80 confirmed kills. He was a national hero in Germany and a legend even among his enemies. The Red Baron flew a distinctive Red Fokker triplane, which is why he got his nickname. He led a squadron called Jasta 11, and they painted their planes in bright colors to intimidate the enemy and boost morale. The Red Baron was a skilled pilot and a smart tactician. He'd study his enemies, learn their patterns, and exploit their weaknesses. He treated air combat like hunting, which is what he'd done before the war. Fighter pilots had a weird kind of war. On one hand, it was incredibly dangerous. Planes were fragile, made of wood and fabric. There were no parachutes for most of the war because commanders thought pilots would bail out too easily if they had them. If your plane caught fire, you had two choices: write it down and hope you survived the crash, or jump and die quickly. Some pilots carried pistols to shoot themselves if their plane caught fire. Planes would catch fire easily because they were made of fabric soaked in a flammable coating called dope, which tightened the fabric and made it waterproof. If a bullet hit the fuel tank or if the engine caught fire, the whole plane could go up in flames in seconds. Pilots were terrified of fire. Many preferred to jump to their death rather than burn alive. On the other hand, pilots were treated like celebrities. They'd fly missions during the day and sleep in actual beds at night. They'd eat decent food, drink wine, and live in relatively comfortable conditions compared to the guys in the trenches. The life expectancy of a new pilot was measured in weeks, but if you survived, you were a hero. New pilots were called Huns by the British, not because they were Germans, but because they were fresh meat. The average life expectancy of a new British pilot on the Western Front in 1917 was about 11 days. Most were shot down before they'd learned enough to survive. The ones who made it past the first few weeks had a much better chance of surviving longer, but those first flights were incredibly dangerous. But the real military value of aircraft was in reconnaissance and artillery spotting. Planes could fly over enemy lines, see where troops were concentrating, where supplies were being moved, and relay that information back. They could help artillery units adjust their fire in real time, making bombardments way more accurate. Before aircraft, artillery observers would climb up trees or church towers to try and see where their shells were landing. With aircraft, you could get a much better view from much farther away. The observer in the plane would use radio or visual signals to tell the artillery whether to adjust left, right, longer, or shorter. This made artillery dramatically more effective. Artillery spotting aircraft would fly in patterns over the battlefield, observing where shells landed and radioing corrections to the artillery batteries. This was dangerous work because the planes had to fly slowly and predictably to observe effectively, which made them easy targets for anti-aircraft guns and enemy fighters. But the improvement in artillery accuracy was worth it. Photography from aircraft became increasingly important. Planes would fly over enemy lines with cameras taking hundreds of photos. These photos would be developed and analyzed by intelligence officers who could spot changes in enemy positions, new fortifications, supply dumps, anything that might be militarily useful. Photo reconnaissance became a science, and entire departments were dedicated to analyzing aerial photos. Later in the war, you had bombers that could drop explosives on enemy positions, airfields, supply depots, even cities. The technology was primitive compared to what came later in World War II, but the foundation was being laid. The Germans bombed London with Zeppelins, and later with Gotha bombers. The damage was minimal compared to what would happen in World War II, but it showed that civilians weren't safe anymore, that the entire country was now part of the battlefield. German Zeppelin raids on Britain were terrifying for civilians who had never experienced anything like it. The Zeppelins would come at night, dropping bombs on cities. The bombs weren't very accurate and didn't cause massive damage, but they created panic. British civilians realized they were now targets in a way that previous generations never had been. This was the beginning of strategic bombing, the idea that you could attack an enemy's home front to damage morale and industrial capacity. The British eventually figured out how to shoot down Zeppelins by using incendiary bullets that would ignite the hydrogen gas inside them. Once a Zeppelin caught fire, it would burn spectacularly, lighting up the night sky. British pilots who shot down Zeppelins became national heroes. But the Germans switched to using Gotha bombers, which were airplanes instead of airships, and much harder to shoot down. Aircraft development during World War I was incredibly rapid. The planes at the end of the war were vastly superior to the ones at the beginning. Speeds doubled, altitude capabilities increased, engines became more powerful and reliable. By 1918, planes were carrying bombs, cameras, radios, and multiple machine guns. The groundwork for modern air forces was established in just 4 years. At the start of the war, planes could barely carry one person and maybe fly for an hour. By the end, you had bombers that could carry tons of bombs hundreds of miles. You had fighters that could fly at 150 miles per hour and reach altitudes of 20,000 feet. You had specialized aircraft for different roles: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance, ground attack. Aviation had evolved from a curiosity to a critical military capability in less than 5 years. Submarines were another weapon that changed everything, especially for naval warfare. The Germans used U-boats to try and starve Britain into submission by sinking merchant ships that were bringing food and supplies. Unrestricted submarine warfare was a massive deal. The idea that submarines would sink civilian ships without warning was considered barbaric by a lot of people. Traditional naval warfare had rules. You'd give warnings, allow crews to evacuate, then sink the ship. Submarines couldn't do that because if they surfaced to give a warning, they'd be vulnerable to attack. The traditional rules of war, called prize rules, said that if you wanted to sink a merchant ship, you had to stop it, search it to make sure it wasn't neutral, allow the crew to get into lifeboats, and only then could you sink it. This made sense in the age of surface ships, but submarines couldn't follow these rules. If a submarine surfaced to give warning, any nearby warship could easily sink it. Submarines were only effective if they stayed hidden and attacked by surprise. The Germans argued that Britain was blockading Germany and preventing food from reaching German civilians, so sinking British merchant ships was fair game. The British blockade of Germany was incredibly effective and caused widespread starvation among German civilians. Hundreds of thousands of Germans died from malnutrition and diseases related to malnutrition. So from the German perspective, submarine warfare was retaliation for what they saw as Britain starving their people. This strategy almost worked. At one point in 1917, German U-boats were sinking so many ships that Britain was maybe 6 weeks away from running out of food. 1 out of every 4 ships leaving British ports was being sunk. The British economy was on the verge of collapse. If the Germans had kept it up for just a bit longer, Britain might have been forced to negotiate. The statistics were staggering. In April 1917, U-boats sank over 860,000 tons of shipping. Britain needed to import about 12 million tons of supplies per year just to survive. At the rate ships were being sunk, the Germans could have cut Britain off completely. British Admiral Jellicoe told the cabinet that Britain would be forced to sue for peace by November 1917 if the losses continued. The British solved this problem with convoys. Instead of having merchant ships sail alone, they'd group them together and protect them with warships. The warships could detect submarines with hydrophones, attack them with depth charges, and generally make it much more dangerous for U-boats to attack. Losses dropped dramatically once the convoy system was fully implemented. The convoy system worked because it was much harder for submarines to find convoys than individual ships. The ocean is huge, and a convoy of 30 or 40 ships took up almost the same amount of space as a single ship when viewed from a submarine periscope. So the probability of a submarine stumbling across a target actually decreased. And when a submarine did find a convoy, it was protected by warships that could sink the submarine. Depth charges were basically barrels filled with explosives that would sink to a certain depth and then explode. The explosion didn't need to hit the submarine directly. The pressure wave from the explosion would crush the submarine's hull. Being inside a submarine under depth charge attack was absolutely terrifying. You'd hear these explosions, feel the submarine shake, wonder if the next one would be close enough to kill you. Submarine crews described depth charge attacks as the most terrifying experience of the war. You'd be underwater, unable to see what was happening above. You'd hear the warships moving around, searching for you. Then you'd hear the splashes as depth charges hit the water. You'd count the seconds, knowing each depth charge was set to explode at a certain depth. Then the explosions would start. The submarine would shake violently. Lights would go out, pipes would burst. If the explosion was close enough, the hull would crack and water would start pouring in. But unrestricted submarine warfare also brought the United States into the war. The sinking of the Lusitania in 1915, which killed over 1,000 people, including 128 Americans, turned public opinion against Germany. The Germans claimed the Lusitania was carrying weapons and ammunition, which was actually true, but it was also carrying civilians. When Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare in 1917, it gave the U.S. the push it needed to declare war. The Lusitania sinking was controversial because the Germans had published warnings in American newspapers telling people not to travel on British ships. They said that any ship in the war zone around Britain was a legitimate target. Some Americans saw this as fair warning, others saw it as a threat. When the Lusitania was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland and sank in 18 minutes, killing over 1,000 people, public opinion in America turned sharply against Germany. The Germans knew that resuming unrestricted submarine warfare would probably bring America into the war, but they gambled that they could starve Britain into surrender before American troops arrived in large numbers. It was a calculated risk, and it didn't pay off. American entry into the war tipped the balance decisively in favor of the Allies. The calculation the Germans made was based on timing. They figured they could sink enough ships to force Britain to surrender in about 6 months. They also figured it would take at least a year for America to mobilize and transport significant numbers of troops to Europe. So they had a 6-month window, but they miscalculated how effective the convoy system would be, and they underestimated how quickly America could mobilize. Here's the thing that ties all these weapons together. None of them individually won the war. The machine gun created the stalemate. Artillery tried to break it, but mostly just killed people. Tanks showed a way forward but weren't reliable enough yet. Gas was horrible, but not decisive. Planes and submarines changed the nature of warfare, but didn't determine the outcome on the Western Front. What actually broke the stalemate was combining all of these weapons with new tactics. By 1918, armies were using combined arms approaches. You'd start with a short, intense artillery barrage using gas and high explosives. Then tanks would advance with infantry following behind. Planes would strafe enemy positions and spot for artillery. It was coordinated, integrated warfare. The key was coordination. Different types of units had to work together, supporting each other. Artillery would suppress enemy defenses. Tanks would break through fortified positions. Infantry would exploit the breakthrough and hold the ground. Aircraft would provide reconnaissance and close air support. Every element had a role, and they all had to work together. The Germans actually figured this out first with their stormtrooper tactics in early 1918. They'd infiltrate through weak points, bypass strong positions, and push deep into enemy territory. It worked really well initially and almost won them the war. German stormtroopers, or Sturmtruppen, were elite infantry units trained in new tactics. Instead of advancing in waves across a broad front, they'd move in small groups, using cover and suppressing fire. They'd carry light machine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers. Their job was to find weak spots in enemy lines, break through, and keep moving. They'd leave strong points for follow-up troops to deal with. The stormtrooper concept was revolutionary. Traditional infantry tactics involved everyone advancing together in a line. If one unit was held up, everyone would stop. Stormtroopers were taught to keep moving. If they encountered resistance, they'd go around it. The goal was to push deep into enemy territory and cause chaos. Strong points that were bypassed would be dealt with by follow-up forces. In the spring offensive of 1918, the Germans used these tactics to break through Allied lines and advance further than anyone had in years. They pushed the British back dozens of miles. They got close enough to Paris that they could shell the city with long-range artillery. For a moment, it looked like Germany might actually win the war. The German spring offensive was called Operation Michael, and it started on March 21, 1918. The Germans hit the British Fifth Army with overwhelming force. They used gas, smoke, and high explosives to neutralize British positions. Then, stormtroopers infiltrated through the British lines while the defenders were still disoriented. The British line collapsed, and the Germans advanced up to 40 miles in some areas. The Germans had one big gun called the Paris gun that could fire shells over 75 miles. They used it to bombard Paris, more for psychological effect than military value. Parisians could hear the explosions and wondered how they were being shelled when the front lines were so far away. It created panic and showed that no place was truly safe from modern weapons. But the Allies adapted. They had more resources, more men, and by late 1918 they were using the same combined arms tactics even, better than the Germans had. The 100 Days offensive that ended the war was basically the Allies using tanks, planes, artillery, and infantry together in a way that the Germans couldn't stop. The 100 Days offensive started in August 1918 and didn't stop until the armistice in November. The Allies attacked constantly, using their advantages in tanks and aircraft. The Germans were exhausted, running out of supplies, and couldn't match the pace. They'd retreat to a defensive line. The Allies would attack and break through, they'd retreat again. It was a running battle that the Germans couldn't win. The Battle of Amiens in August 1918 was called the Black Day of the German Army by German General Ludendorff. The Allies used over 500 tanks in a surprise attack. They broke through German lines and advanced 8 miles on the first day. German units surrendered in large numbers, some without even fighting. Ludendorff realized the war was lost. What made the 100 Days offensive work was the combination of fresh American troops, improved tactics, and overwhelming material superiority. The Americans brought millions of fresh soldiers who hadn't been worn down by years of fighting. The British and French had learned from their mistakes and were using combined arms tactics effectively. And the Allies had more tanks, more planes, more guns, more everything. By November 1918, the German army was falling apart. Morale was gone. Soldiers were surrendering in large numbers. The home front was collapsing, with strikes and food riots. The German Navy mutinied. The government had no choice but to ask for an armistice. The German home front had been suffering for years due to the British blockade. Food was scarce. Coal was scarce. Everything was rationed. Workers were going on strike. There was talk of revolution. The German government knew they couldn't continue the war much longer even if the army held the line. The military situation and the domestic situation both demanded an end to the fighting. World War I weapons changed warfare permanently. After this war, every military in the world knew that you needed machine guns, artillery, tanks, planes, and coordinated tactics. The age of cavalry charges and linear warfare was over. Warfare had become industrial, mechanized, and terrifyingly efficient at killing people. These weapons also made war way more deadly. World War I killed somewhere between 15 and 20 million people. That's more than all the major European wars of the previous 100 years combined, and a huge part of that death toll was because of these new weapons. Machine guns and artillery could kill on a scale that was previously unimaginable. To put that in perspective, the Napoleonic Wars, which lasted over a decade, killed maybe 5 to 6 million people. World War I killed 3 times that many in just 4 years. The American Civil War, which was considered incredibly bloody, killed about 600,000 people. World War I killed that many in the first few months. The legacy of World War I weapons is still with us. Tanks are still the backbone of ground forces. Machine guns are standard infantry weapons. Artillery is still the king of the battlefield in conventional warfare. The basic principles of combined arms warfare that were developed in World War I are still taught in military academies today. Every modern military uses the combined arms approach that was developed in World War I. Infantry, armor, artillery, and air support all work together. The specific weapons have changed, but the basic concept is the same. You use different types of units to support each other and create an effect greater than the sum of the parts. Chemical weapons left such a horrible legacy that they're banned by international law. Flamethrowers are also restricted, but most of the other weapons developed in World War I just evolved into more advanced versions. Modern tanks are direct, descendants of those first British Mark I tanks. Modern fighter jets trace their lineage back to those early biplanes with machine guns. The tank evolved from the slow, unreliable Mark I to the fast, powerful main battle tanks of today. But the basic concept is the same. Armored vehicle with tracks that can cross rough terrain and survive enemy fire while delivering its own firepower. Every tank in service today follows the pattern established by the Renault FT, rotating turret, tracks, armor, main gun. World War I also showed that industrial capacity matters as much as military skill. The side that can produce more shells, more bullets, more tanks, more planes, that side has a huge advantage. This led to total war, where entire economies are organized around military production. It led to targeting of civilian infrastructure because destroying factories hurts the war effort. Total war meant that everyone was involved. Women worked in factories making ammunition, children collected scrap metal. Farmers were told what to grow. Industries were nationalized or heavily controlled by the government. Everything was directed toward winning the war. This was a new kind of conflict where the entire society was mobilized. The concept of strategic bombing, attacking enemy industry and civilian morale, came from World War I. The Germans bombed London to try to break British morale and disrupt industry. It didn't work very well with the technology available in 1918, but it established the precedent. In World War II, strategic bombing would become a major part of the war effort. The weapons of World War I also changed how we think about war. Before 1914, war was often seen as glorious, heroic, a test of national character. After World War I, people understood that modern war is just horror. There's nothing glorious about being blown apart by artillery, gassed, burned with flamethrowers, or mowed down by machine guns. The poets and writers who came out of World War I wrote about the futility and waste of it all. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon, who actually fought in the war, wrote about the reality of combat in a way that destroyed the romantic notions of warfare. Owen's poem, Dulce et decorum est, describes a gas attack in graphic detail and calls the old saying, "It is sweet and fitting to die for your country," a lie. These weren't anti-war activists. They were soldiers telling the truth about what war was really like. So, yeah, these weapons changed warfare forever. They turned combat into an industrial process, made defense stronger than offense for the first time in centuries, and forced militaries to completely rethink how wars were fought. World War I was the last old war and the first modern war, and these weapons are the reason why. The transition from 19th century warfare to 20th century warfare happened in just 4 years. In 1914, cavalry was still considered important. By 1918, everyone knew that tanks and planes were the future. The learning curve was steep and paid for in blood, but by the end of the war, modern warfare had been born. The lessons learned from these weapons shaped World War II and every conflict since. Military planners studied what worked and what didn't. They saw that tanks needed better armor and bigger guns. They saw that planes needed to be faster and carry more weapons. They saw that coordination between different types of units was essential. Everything that happened in World War I became the foundation for modern military doctrine. Germany, despite losing World War I, learned valuable lessons about combined arms warfare and mobile operations. These lessons would be applied in World War II with devastating effect in the form of blitzkrieg. The Germans perfected the art of coordinating tanks, infantry, and air power to create breakthroughs and exploit them rapidly. And maybe the most important lesson was that these weapons made war so destructive that it should be avoided, if at all possible. The generation that fought World War I saw their friends die in horrific ways, and many of them spent the rest of their lives trying to prevent it from happening again. They failed, because World War II happened just 21 years later, but the attempt was there. The veterans of World War I tried to warn the next generation about the horrors of war, but their warnings weren't heeded. The next generation grew up hearing about the war but didn't really understand it. By the time World War II started, there were new leaders who hadn't experienced the trenches and thought they could do better. They were wrong. The weapons that changed warfare in World War I didn't just change how battles were fought. They changed how nations prepared for war, how economies were organized, how societies thought about conflict. The modern world, for better or worse, was shaped by the machine guns, artillery, tanks, planes, and all the other weapons that turned the Great War into the bloodiest conflict in human history up to that point. World War I established the pattern for modern warfare. It showed that industrial nations could sustain years of intense combat by mobilizing their entire economies. It showed that technology gave huge advantages to whoever developed and deployed it effectively. It showed that casualties could reach levels previously unimaginable. And it showed that in modern war, there are no real winners, just survivors. The weapons of World War I killed millions, but they also taught lessons that have shaped military thinking for over a century. Combined arms warfare, the importance of logistics and industrial production, the value of air power and armored vehicles, and the horrors of chemical weapons, all of these came from World War I. Understanding these weapons and their impact helps us understand not just history, but the world we live in today. Check out the next video.